I'm going to have a presentation in relation to introducing the International Collaboratory for Leadership in Universally Designed Education. So my name is Seán Bracken. I'm a principal lecturer at the University of Worcester in the United Kingdom. And just, sorry, it's actually not sharing here, so. Oh yeah, I think I'm in. Am I still sharing with you?
No, I think you just ended your share there, Seán. So if you'd like to restart it, that's no problem at all.
All right, I think what I'm going to have to do is probably share from here, because it doesn't give me the function to share automatically. So I'll have to flick through this, if that's all right.
So we can't see it here. That's okay. We can't see your share yet.
Okay, I'll just bear with me again. Sorry about that.
That's okay. So
minimize this a bit.
Just to say, while you're sorting that there, there's a few people dropping in some of the other sectors they're from. So I can see somebody is from arts and disability. We can see your screen now, Seán. So if you put that in presentation mode, you should be good to go.
Yeah, good. Okay, so unfortunately, when I put it on full screen, it somehow doesn't interface with the capacity to share. So I'm just going to use this.
That's okay. If you maybe just pop the zoom up down the bottom right-hand corner so we can see it a bit bigger, that'll be fine.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm just going to work from what I have here, I'm afraid. So just to give you an overview, I'm going to be setting the scene initially and then providing a bit of a background and a rationale for Include, and then sharing some of the goals for the International Collaboratory for Leadership in Universally Designed Education, giving you a background as to what the conceptual framework that it has underpinned our kind of shared collaborative work internationally, and disseminating some of the aims, sharing those aims with you, and giving you an insight as to kind of currently where we are and what our next steps are in terms of the International Collaboratory for Universally Designed Education. So in the first instance, what I'd ask you to do is to just think about your own levels of diversity with the students with whom you're engaged. So if you wouldn't mind taking that opportunity to write into the chat box, you know, what's some of the diversities of students with whom you're engaged? So for example, currently in my role as learning and teaching coordinator within the University of Worcester, and within my role as a lecturer, I'm working with a lot of first generation students, and I'm working with students who have linguistic diversity and ethnic diversity. So I'd just like you to reflect a little bit in relation to your own learners and the natures of the diversities that are part of your student identities. And with that in mind, thinking about kind of the nature of diversity, incorporating disability, but also incorporating many of those attributes of individuals' identities, and coming to what is perhaps increasingly known in the research as intersectionality, so addressing all of the needs of particular learners. And with that in mind, I began to work from being inspired at one of the AHEAD conferences 3 years ago, was inspired to network with a diversity of researchers from around the world and to collaborate on the development of kind of shared insights from around the world in relation to the application of universal design for learning in higher education. And subsequently, we got together and we developed this book entitled Transforming Higher Education Through Universal Design for Learning. And one of the critical authors in that book was Professor Richard Jackson from Boston College. And subsequent to the writing and publication of that book, which was published and launched at the AHEAD conference last year, in fact, what we did was recognize the necessity for researchers to have a domain where we could come together nationally and internationally to share insights around the application of universal design for learning in a diversity of settings, both cultural, geographic, and linguistic. And I think just learning from the growth of universal design for learning, which was, I suppose, initially a North American phenomenon, and then kind of thinking about its application more widely in the world. So with that in mind, Richard and I began a conversation with an extended body of researchers, including Aisha Abdul Sattar from the online university in South Africa, which is the largest online provider in South Africa, and with some other colleagues from around the world. And we began to explore, well, how could we develop a network of international colleagues and researchers who would have some shared concepts around what the conceptual frameworks to underpin our understandings and approaches might be. And ultimately, we came up with the concept of conjoining the very rich framework potential that exists within Universal Design for Learning, and matching that along with the concept of global culturally sustaining pedagogies. And there's a lot of research around globally sustaining pedagogies, especially from a cultural dimension. So conjoining those two frameworks in order to enrich our understanding as to how best we could collaborate across the world. So what are our aims? And these were shared with colleagues at the 4th Universal Design for Learning Pan-Canadian Conference in October of last year. So our aims were to promote universal design as a moral and global imperative and a socially just approach to achieving inclusive education, to showcase internationally culturally sustainable examples of best practice pertaining to the application of universal design for learning. And we're consistently on the lookout for examples of cross-cultural engagement in relation to universal design for learning, to seek out and promote opportunities for collaborative international pedagogy and research focused on the design, application, and impact of universal design for learning throughout all sectors of the formal and informal education. And whilst we're aware that there's a growing and more convincing body of research around the application of universal design for learning, that is still rather new. And so what we'd like to do is to provide a forum in which colleagues can share insights from the research, particularly if it has an international dimension to it. So the goal number 4, to explore the application of the UDL framework and meeting learning requirements of students where intersectionality is a feature of being and identity. And finally, to identify and disseminate affordances of information technologies in relation to universally designed education, particularly mindful of the Sustainable Development Goals and being mindful of the requirements of the Global South. So I'm mindful of the fact that perhaps colleagues will find this particular presentation maybe a little bit more challenging to read, but rest assured that a copy of this will be made available to you, and you'll be able to have a look at that and see the slides in greater detail. So just in terms of our formative developments and achievements to date, we've already established an international Include steering committee, and there's representation on that from India, from South Africa, from the United States, from Morocco, and from the UK. And I suppose the UK incorporating the fact that I'm from Ireland as well, so we have an Irish dimension to that as well. And what we've managed to do thus far is work with colleagues in Canada, in particular David Stinton and Patrick Clark here in the UK at the University of Worcester as well, in scripting our action-oriented values. And I believe that Christine from AHEAD is going to make that link available to colleagues. They're very, very rich action-based values, and I would encourage people who are interested in perhaps setting up any kind of a network to perhaps peruse those values. I think you'll find them of interest and of benefit to you. And we're also creating links with key organizations and peers. We have 50 colleagues who are part of the Include network currently in 16 jurisdictions and pretty much all continents of the planet. We've hosted 2 online seminars, one of which was hosted some 2 weeks ago and looking at the implications of coronavirus in particular in relation to its global impact on accessibility in education and online education in particular. And our colleague Virna Rossi from the University of Ravensburg in London has very generously provided 16 very brief videos in regards to making that fast move to online learning, and they're accessible on the Developing Include website at the moment. And also we have a current development of a shared multilingual website, as I mentioned, which is under development. And those are some of the key areas of progress currently. So with that, and listen to the tambourine in the background, I'll pass over for questions and discussions. And they're also at the end of this particular slide, which you'll be able to share later on with you, some additional references. So over to you, Dara. So apologies about that hitch in relation to not being able to share my screen. So I do apologize.
That's no problem at all, Seán. And we understand that you know, everyone's adapting to this new reality, so it takes some time for us all to make those adaptations, and things don't always run as smoothly as they can. So if you wouldn't mind unsharing your screen there, we think that's perfect. So a couple of questions. If anybody has a question from the floor, please feel free to drop it in there now. I'm going to start with one myself. I just wondered, do you have any advice, having worked in a sort of a learning network like this? Presumably you're meeting online across, countries all over the world. Just wonder if you have any advice for locals here looking to begin and start their own networks around inclusion, maybe more local networks. Do you have any advice around how those can operate? And in terms of, you mentioned this building a kind of shared understanding of inclusion. I think the networking is a really important aspect to that. So do you have any advice on that side of it, to kind of more practical level?
I think it's kind of building on the Etienne Wenger's presentation at the start as well, which is getting those people together that are going to really invest the time and energy in order to make the network worthwhile, and who are going to be prepared to contribute in a really valuable way. And as I've mentioned, Virna Rossi's contribution is a great example of that. Other colleagues, Tracy Galvin, for example, from Queen's University in Northern Ireland. So getting those people who are dynamic, who are committed to universal design for learning, and who have a passion particularly to share their learning more globally. So I'd suggest that's probably what it is, getting those like-minded people together and creating that sense of energy and creating a sense of vision, and being determined to carry through with that vision. This hasn't been without its hitches. So I think it takes a lot of resilience and a lot of determination to carry through with the vision as well. We
have a question, actually, a kind of more incidental question a little bit from the floor. About David actually asks, you mentioned the Global South. The Global South. He actually asked, what is defined as the Global South?
Well, I suppose what we have is the Global North to some extent, which is what used to be known as the developed world, and the Global South, which is the developing world. But it's perhaps best seen in terms of equity, issues around equity and equality. And the assumptions I presume that we make both culturally and materialistically in relation to what might be the norm, what is our norm. So it's kind of questioning those aspects of access to technology, for example. So for us, engaging in these types of online CPD exercises comes as, to some extent, second nature now, particularly over the past few weeks. But there are a lot of presumptions, I think, that we have in relation to that, around access to the equipment, around access to the resources, and what that means. So what types of technologies people are using, for example. And it tends to be in the Global South that people will have access generally to a mobile phone, for example. So it's thinking about how we alter our thinking to best suit what exists in a multiplicity of contexts, and also being mindful of cultural interactions online as well, the necessity to be a little bit perhaps inquisitive around our own practices and practices of others as well, so that we're maximizing the potential for engagement right across the world.
Excellent, excellent. Just so, Lisa and Barbara, if you wouldn't mind beginning to turn your audio and video on, I'm just going to ask Seán one final question before we go. So I can see in the group here in the chat box, lots of people have responded to your question around the diversities, and we're seeing every different type of diversity possibly imagine coming up there. I'm going to ask you a really hard question to finish with.
Thanks, Sarah. And
When
this
you can,
hasn't been practiced. This hasn't been practiced in
yeah, I know. I probably should have warned you about this. No, it's just this idea of us as diverse learners. And sometimes with diversity, we can think of it as something separate to ourselves. So I want to ask you what kind of diversities you bring to the table as a learner yourself and a practitioner.
Oh gosh, where to start? How long do we have, Dara? So I think there. I suppose to some extent I have an international background and dimension, so that linguistic diversity is one. But also, I mean, you know, we're all kind of to some extent on a spectrum, and I suppose I might be a little bit further advanced on that spectrum than other people in relation to aspects of neurodiversity. So I think, and that pertains to everybody. So it's kind of thinking about my own experiences in relation to my own educational experiences, and that attribute of neurodiversity and linguistic diversity. And I suppose coming from, you know, an Irish background and living in the UK as well, I'm still an immigrant, you know, as you know, close as we are culturally and linguistically, there are also differences, and so I suppose I bring that element of richness as well, and I suppose access to and passion for technology and enabling features towards technology. So as much as everybody else, Dara, I have lots of attributes.